Hello and welcome to Filling the Sink, a podcast from Catalan News. My name is Beth Cohen, I'm a British actress and presenter, and I'm delighted to be joining the team here at Catalan News as your host for the next few episodes. On today's podcast, we're taking a stroll through Barcelona's cemeteries. As All Saints' Day approaches on the 1st of November, many Catalan families will be visiting the graves of their loved ones, taking flowers and paying their respects to the dead. But what is actually celebrated here on the 31st of October and the 1st of November? And how do Catalan traditions compare to other national and international festivities? Joining me today is Emma Monrós. Hello there, Emma.
Hello, it's great to be here.
Now, Emma, as far as I understand, in Catalonia we have a double celebration. There's the Catalan tradition of la Castanyada.
Exactly, and that is on the night of the 31st.
And it's followed by All Saints' Day on the 1st of November. Now, you might remember our very first podcast, like way back in 2020, when we talked about Halloween versus the Catalan tradition of la Castanyada. But for those of our listeners who didn't catch that episode, can you give us a brief overview of what la Castanyada is?
Yes, so la Castanyada is a centuries-old tradition in Catalonia which traces its roots back to when people would huddle beside the fire to eat seasonal foods.
That sounds great. And what do these seasonal foods include? Hang on a minute, one of them's chestnuts, right?
Yes, in Catalan they are castañas, and that is why it is called la Castanyada, and they are roasted chestnuts, so you may have seen street vendors around Barcelona roasting and selling hot chestnuts. And other foods we typically eat are baked sweet potatoes as well as marzipan treats, also known as panayets.
Okay, but nowadays you don't huddle beside the fire, do you?
No, we don't, but it is still an occasion to get together with friends and family to eat, drink, and celebrate in general.
That sounds like a lot of fun. And if you want to learn more about La Castanyada, do check out episode 1 of Filling the Sink. But today we're going to take a closer look at the more serious side of this celebration, which is, of course, remembering the dead.
Exactly. The 1st of November is All Saints' Day, a holiday in many Catholic countries.
Also known as All Hallows' Day, it's a day to celebrate all the saints in the Christian church, whether they're known or unknown. It's a national holiday in Spain in which everyone's given the day off work in order to be able to get together with family and go to the cemetery.
Yes, and when they go to the cemetery to remember their dead relatives, they bring flowers to their grave. So if you go to a cemetery after Halloween, you will see a lot of fresh flowers. However, I would say that this tradition is in decline, and these days fewer people go to the cemetery in All Saints' Day, but in general, it is still a quiet day of remembrance.
So in that way, it's quite similar to the traditions in other countries with a Catholic or a Christian population. The way in which we humans lay someone to rest is frequently influenced by religion and the beliefs associated with it. But of course, it can also be affected by city planning and what is more practical at the end of the day.
Yes, in some countries, cemeteries are beautiful green spaces similar to parks, but that is not really the case here. Cemeteries in Catalonia are like small cities. We could say cities of the dead.
Cities? So there are buildings as well?
More or less, cemeteries in Catalonia have niche tombs, which are vertical sepulchres. You should imagine a wall with several rows and columns with niches on it, and that is where the coffins go.
So you mean the coffins and the urns are kind of stacked one on top of the other, like on shelves?
Yeah, kind of.
So it's not a tradition to bury the deceased in an underground grave?
Well, you can also see that here, but it is usually only people of a certain social class who do that because it is more expensive.
That's really interesting.
In the olden days, status was also shown through grief. Nowadays, things have changed, obviously, but in general, the idea of a cemetery comes from one of the first cemeteries in Catalonia and in Barcelona, which is the Cemetery of Poblenou.
So to find out a bit more about this fascinating graveyard, you went there and talked with Adrià Terol, who's a cultural manager of the cemeteries in Barcelona. Let's hear more about it.
The Poblenou Cemetery is the oldest cemetery in Barcelona and indeed the whole of Catalonia, and it was used as a reference for the construction of other local cemeteries. But what is the story behind the Poblenou Cemetery?
Aquest cementiri es va construir a finals del segle XVIII, quan Barcelona encara era una ciutat emmurallada.
This cemetery was built at the end of the 18th century when Barcelona was still a walled city, with a lot of structural deficiencies. The population increase during the Industrial Revolution, combined with insufficient hygiene, caused health problems for the city's residents. At the time, the deceased were buried in parochial pits in the church graveyards. These communal graves began to collapse, turning into a source of epidemics and incurable infectious diseases. That is the main reason why the diocese decided to build a cemetery outside the city walls.
Es va decidir construir un cementiri fora les muralles de Barcelona i situar-lo a Sant Martí de Provençals.
The cemetery is on the coast of the Catalan capital, near to Bogatell Beach, which at the time was considered a long way from the city centre. But why was this cemetery used as a reference point for other projects?
Sí, va ser el 1819.
Antonio Ginesi was an Italian architect during the Age of Enlightenment. In 1819, he designed a cemetery that promoted social equality, where everyone could be buried in the same way, respecting the person's individuality regardless of their social or economic status. This is why the niche tomb appears, this vertical sepulture on the wall. It was an innovative cemetery.
Era un cementiri innovador.
However, that idea of equality in the design changed later on.
Sí, a mitjans del segle XIX, la bourgeoisie, aquesta nova classe social...
In the middle of the 19th century, a new elite social class emerged. The bourgeoisie were rich and powerful and wanted to differentiate themselves from the rest of the population. They started the construction of the second enclosure, which used to be known as the Rich People's Cemetery. Here, the bourgeoisie made use of art and culture as a social distinction, commissioning the best architects and sculptors from Catalonia and abroad to work on their tombs.
Els millors arquitectes i els millors escultors del moment, tant catalans com també estrangers.
And that investment in art and culture is really visible throughout the new part of the cemetery, which feels like an open-air museum filled with sumptuous sculptures. One of these unique sculptures is the Kiss of Death, or el Petó de la Mort in Catalan.
Aquesta escultura representa la mort.
This sculpture represents death, which is shown as an angel, a winged skeleton kissing a young boy. The boy has his mouth half open and his stomach is contracted because he is taking his last breath. His arms hang down and his hands touch the floor as his mortal body surrenders.
Les mans tocant a terra com a gest de defalliment del cos humà. No?
This grave, which portrays death, is the Iaudet Soler family's testimony to the loss of a beloved son. The Kiss of Death is a shocking work of art which has gained international fame and these days is one of Barcelona's most famous sculptures.
L'obra escultòrica més famosa de Barcelona, la més impactant i coneguda també ja arreu del món.
Thanks to the online popularity of sculptures such as the Kiss of Death, the cemetery receives many visitors. Locals and foreign visitors alike come to Poblenou to see el Petó de la Mort and other famous works in the cemetery.
Thank you to Adrià Terol for sharing those insights on Poblenou Cemetery. Emma, what did you think of the visit? That Kiss of Death sounds really quite creepy.
Well, as Adrià mentioned during the visit, the cemetery is like an open-air museum, especially the part with the sculptures and the art. And the Kiss of Death is a really well-made sculpture, so yeah, it can be kind of creepy. Also, if you go around it, it looks as though the skeleton's eyes are following you. It feels like he's watching you.
Ooh, it's truly spooky. I'm certainly getting into the Halloween spirit. Now, as well as the Cemetery de Poblenou, one of Barcelona's most famous and certainly most visible cemeteries is Montjuïc, located on a hill by the port. Montjuïc is visible from pretty much anywhere in the city, and together with Tibidabo, it's one of Barcelona's most unmistakable landmarks.
Yes, it is an iconic area with a lot of history and a great place to visit museums or the Castle of Montjuïc as well.
And did you know that the name Montjuïc literally means Jewish mountain?
No, I didn't know that.
Yes, it's because the remains of a medieval Jewish cemetery have been found there. However, the cemetery which we see today was inaugurated in 1883 as a response to the lack of space in the small local cemeteries in the city centre, such as Sants, Les Corts and Sant Andreu, which were already at full capacity and they couldn't expand any further in an already built-up area.
So they expanded and saw Montjuïc as a place to create a new cemetery. And on Montjuïc, the gravestones spread out over the hillside, divided into 14 sections covering 57 hectares.
Yes, there are even street names. It's exactly what you were saying about a miniature city. Some of Barcelona's most illustrious residents have been buried here, such as the famous president of the Catalan government, Francesc Macià.
Yes, so Francesc Macià was the first president that Catalonia had had in over 200 years, from 1931 to 1933.
And Emma, I believe that there's a dark legend that surrounds his death.
Yes, when he died on Christmas Day in 1933, his body was buried in the family's grave, but not all of it.
What?
His heart was separated from his body. It was an idea from the Romantic era inspired in the Habsburg dynasty, where the kings were buried embalmed and their hearts were put in boxes exposed in the Augustinian church in Vienna. So that is what they did here, and they put Macià's heart in formaldehyde, a chemical formula that is used to preserve bodies to prevent them from decomposing.
Ew. And where did the box with his heart go to?
Well, it started in the attic of the Palau de la Generalitat, where the government is, but in 1939, when a lot of Catalans fled the country because of the Civil War and Francoism, so did the heart of Francesc Macià.
What? Was the heart also trying to escape the Civil War?
Well, the heart didn't flee by itself. Josep Tarradellas, who at the time was the finance minister and later on became the Catalan president, found out that the box was there and took it with him when he left in exile.
Okay, so it was a kind of heart on the run through France.
Yeah, the heart went to Saint Raphael in France, and then later on to Saint-Martin-le-Vaux. There it was buried, but not in a cemetery. It was Josep Tarradellas' father who buried it in a vineyard, together with some papers from the Catalan government. Once World War II was over, Tarradellas decided to unbury it and put it in a safe at a French bank, where it spent some years until 1965. But it was removed from the bank because liquid had poured from the box with the heart, but the content was safe. Then Tarradellas kept it in his house in France until he could return from exile.
That's disgusting. What a bizarre ceremony. I think that's one of the most unusual rituals I have ever heard of. Now, to learn a bit more about the history of funeral rites in Catalonia, we visited the Museum of Funeral Carriages on Montjuïc. It's the only collection of its kind in Europe, and Emma talked to Adrià Terol about the history of Catalan funeral carriages, what they were used for, and how funeral rites have changed over time. Let's hear how they got on.
Today we're visiting Barcelona's Funeral Carriages Museum, a unique collection of funeral carriages and hearses dating from the 19th and early 20th century. But what exactly is the story behind this extraordinary collection?
Doncs és la col·lecció de carrosses fúnebres que va ser inaugurada l'any 1970.
This collection of funeral carriages was opened in 1970 and was initially displayed in the basement of the Sancho de Ávila morgue, but in 2012 it was relocated here to the Montjuïc Cemetery. It is a unique collection in Europe. There are no other collections of carriages strictly for funerals, and it's a reflection of the evolution of the funerary ritual in the city in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Des dels segles XIX i XX.
And this ritual was also a way to show which social class the deceased came from.
Totes aquestes carrosses el que intenten reproduir són els vehicles de la vella aristocràcia.
All these carriages are trying to imitate the vehicles of the old aristocracy. The bourgeoisie was initially a revolutionary social class, but little by little the people began to take on the habits and customs of the old aristocracy. They copied the design of the vehicles and adapted them to hearses, which is why some of them even have glass windows, which are really just for show.
Sí, a la primera part de la sala tenim carrosses que duia la burgesia del moment, les classes més benestants de Barcelona.
In the first part of the hall, we have the carriages used by the bourgeoisie, the wealthiest social classes in Barcelona at the time. There are also carriages used by the general population, the working class. These carriages are simple, like this one here, which was a regular car. It was popularly referred to as a spider car, as its structure reminds us of spiders' legs. Depending on the number of horses used to pull it, which could vary between 1 and 8, it was considered quite prestigious.
I finalment a darrere hi ha la carrossa que conduïen sobretot personatges del món de la cultura, com per exemple...
And finally at the back, there is the carriage that was used mainly by cultural figures, such as Antoni Gaudí, Joan Maragall and Narcís Oller, for example. These were illustrious members of society who did not want to be as showy as the bourgeoisie, but were also given luxury carriages.
and the white carriages were used for babies and children who died, and also for nuns or people who were considered pure. The decoration and the details of these carriages are very interesting.
Doncs normalment hi havia simbologies que t'expliquen el pas del temps.
Usually there were symbols referring to the passage of time, such as the winged hourglass, called tempus fugit in Latin. This depicts the brevity of time, showing that life is finite and it flies by. The symbology of the owl was also very common, and we also see it throughout the cemeteries, in the sculptures and ironwork. Since the time of the Romans, the owl has been associated with the goddess Athena, with wisdom, and since the owl is an animal that sees well at night, it was also believed that it was able to see their death. Therefore, it offered guidance to the souls of the dead.
However, the museum not only displays these carriages, it also explores how funeral ceremonies have evolved here in Catalonia and what a funeral meant for a family.
Bé, a les visites el que podem explicar és l'evolució del ritual funerari.
On visits, we explained the evolution of the funerary ritual, how parish funeral pits fell into disuse and people started to be buried in cemeteries, and how the vigils that used to be held in people's homes started to take place at the morgue. The whole process, therefore, touches on many different issues, such as gender issues, the role of women, and how they took part in the funeral ceremony. Women were almost invisible. They had a very secondary role because, for example, mourning in public was only permitted for men.
La mostra de dol en públic estava restringit als homes.
The collection also includes pictures of the funerals of popular Catalan figures, where we can observe the carriages that they used and appreciate just how many people went to pay their last respect to this artist or politician. It's a real journey back in time.
Thank you, Emma and Adrià. That was a fascinating insight into funeral traditions in another era. Now, I'm imagining that the funeral carriages look like something designed by Disney to take Cinderella to the ball. Is that right?
Well, I would say yes, but imagine it all in black and goth. And if you want to find out yourselves, then the Museum of Funeral Carriages is open on Saturdays and Sundays from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. There are regular guided visit tours in Catalan and Spanish, but if you want to also do the visit in English, then you can book in advance.
And you can also visit the Poblenou and Montjuïc cemeteries with a guided tour on alternate Sundays. Check out the website Cemeteries de Barcelona for more details.
And if you're interested in doing something spooky for Halloween or All Saints' Day, there are some great options in Barcelona. In fact, there is a whole dark tourism industry which has grown around people's interest in the supernatural.
Yes, actually, my personal favourites are the ghost and mystery tours of the Gothic Quarter run by Mysterium Tours. And there's also the nightmare horror museums where you can discover horrific local legends, such as the story of the monster of Banyoles. Now, I actually live right by Banyoles Lake, and I was really surprised to find out about this Catalan equivalent of the Loch Ness Monster.
Yes, that's really interesting. But you can also do something at home, and you can always stay in, watch a scary movie, and make some panayettes.
That sounds like a great plan. It's clear that every culture has its own unique way of dealing with death, and there are some striking international examples. From dancing with the dead in Madagascar to the public cremation of bodies at Varanasi in India, from the laments of professional mourners in China to Tibetan sky burial in which bodies are left out for birds to eat, thus returning the soul to the sky. Death is something that unites us all, and which we will all ultimately experience one day. And although in Western culture our way of grieving is often very private, the pain that we feel when losing a loved one is universal.
Yes, I think that is the essence of All Saints' Day. It's a time to reflect on the people we have lost and be grateful for those who still walk among us.
Today we've explored two of Barcelona's most iconic cemeteries and dived into how locals celebrate at this time of year.
Plus, we've also given you some ideas of spooky things to see and do in and around Barcelona.
Now that's almost all we've got time for today, but before we go, I'd like to finish with our Catalan phrase of the week. Emma, what do we have for today?
This week we have assemblar-se com un ou a una castanya.
Okay, so that's like, they look like each other, like an egg and a chestnut. Is that right?
Exactly, so basically they don't look anything like each other.
Okay, so you could say this, for example, about two siblings, and one is like tall and blonde and the other one is like small with dark hair.
Exactly.
In English, we say like chalk and cheese.
Yeah, that's a perfect translation.
Assemblarse com un ou o una castanya. That's a perfect saying for this time of year. Thank you, Emma. So whether you're feasting on panellets this weekend, remembering your loved ones, or checking out some of Barcelona's scariest tourist attractions, on behalf of all of us here at Catalan News, we wish you a very happy All Saints' Day. Feliç dia de Tots Sants. Thank you for listening, and goodbye for now. Fins aviat. Adeu.